Well, kia ora koutou. Welcome to our webinar this afternoon. My name is Steve Hanrahan. I'm the Advocacy Manager for TIA. I'd like to call on Chris Roberts, Chief Executive of TIA, to open with our karakia.
Mea karakia tātou. Mori oho, mori tū, mori ora. Kia tātou, home e, hui e, tāki e.
Tāki e.
Life Force Awaken, Life Force Stand Tall, Life Force All Wellness, good health to all. Let us join together to make progress.
Great, thanks Chris. Welcome along everyone to our webinar on employment matters and what employers need to consider during COVID-19. The format for the webinar this afternoon, we have two panellists, Chris Roberts from TIA, and also welcome to Fiona McMillan from Lane Neave. Our format is that each panellist will talk for up to 5 minutes and then we'll do Q&A. Just a reminder to send your Q&A through. There's at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the Q&A button there, so please send your questions through. We've allowed 30 minutes for the webinar, but we may go longer if there's Q&A. Fiona tells me she's available through till 3 o'clock. So we'll see how we go and the questions that are coming through. Chris, back to you to open.
Thanks, Steve. For those presuming that you can see me, I've got a Dawson City Yukon shirt on today, not normal formal wear. Just because I was on the phone in contact with some colleagues up in the Yukon on the other side of the world, and just brought home that what we're dealing with in New Zealand is being dealt with right around the world. There you've got a small isolated community who were looking forward to going into their high season, and that's been taken away from them completely, and very many of the same issues we're grappling with have been dealt with there up in northern Canada, and no doubt in many other places around the world. Just a quick wrap from me on latest developments that we're aware of. One of the issues, of course, is repatriation of the tens of thousands of overseas visitors who are in New Zealand. Certainly well over 100,000 if you include students, those here on work visas, working holiday visas, and leisure travellers. At the moment, there's very few flights out of the country. There are 12 flights today. The only airlines leaving New Zealand currently, flying out of New Zealand, are Air New Zealand, Malaysian Airlines, and Qatar Airways. About 1,500 seats I saw were available today for flights out of New Zealand, and they won't all be full depending on the social distancing rules put in place for those flights. So, perhaps only around 1,000 people at best able to leave each day. And if you think we probably have well over 100,000 people who might like to leave, there are a lot of overseas guests who are stranded here in New Zealand for the meantime. There may be an announcement in the next hour or so from the Prime Minister on repatriation. A number of countries are trying to get flights into New Zealand. One of the barriers is the restriction on domestic travel right now. So you can't catch a domestic flight, those few that are left, to get to Auckland Airport, which is the only place where there are international flights going from. If you're in the South Island, basically you can't get to Auckland Airport for a flight. If you're in the North Island, you have to drive. There may need to be some relaxation of those restrictions if countries are going to organise repatriation flights to get people home. In the meantime, many of you on the call will be in some way aware of stranded visitors. You may be looking after some. We've got to show a high degree of care to these people while they're in our country and stranded here. They're under as much stress as everyone else. The media might focus on the bad behaviour of one or two, but most of these people are doing the right thing, hunkering down, and we need to look after them while they're here. And of course, some may choose to stay here, feeling they're much better off staying in New Zealand than heading home right now. There are some, if anyone is struggling to cope with guests and feel that you've got an unsafe health situation, there is the temporary accommodation service available. You can get hold of that and arrange for people to be moved somewhere else to more more secure accommodation options. So don't think that people where they are is where they have to stay if that situation is not a healthy situation for people to be in. In terms of business support, the banks have come out today with more details on the government guaranteed loans. That's up to $500,000 per business if your annual revenue is between $250,000 and $80 million. So those details are now available from the bank, and every business already should be having frequent conversations with their bank, and now the details of the loan scheme are available. We have heard that some banks are still, even with the government guarantee, are still reluctant to be extending loans to tourism businesses, especially those heavily exposed to international visitors. Please, if you have that sort of conversation with your bank, if you're getting a rather pessimistic response, please let us know. Please let us know at info@tia.org.nz. We want to gather those examples and, if necessary, make a case to government that if tourism businesses are being shut out of access to those loans. There's also talk of some rent relief. Many businesses are facing having high fixed costs with their leases or rents still in place. There is no details yet, but there has been some talk the government may come out with some sort of rent relief, so look out for that. In terms of job losses, hopefully many of you on the call are receiving a wage subsidy, and your businesses have been able to take advantage of the wage subsidy, but we know there are also going to be job losses. I think we can expect some announcements over the next few days from some of the major players, the like New Zealand, Scotland, those big workforces so far, and then making tough calls on redundancies, and we'll see. And that'll just be the start of lots of redundancies. We're aware of that. I'm sure everyone's seen the predictions of where the unemployment queue might go to. We're all looking, of course, at recovery, and a lot of thinking is starting on recovery now, how we emerge, what the pathway to emerging in recovery might look like. Clearly, it's going to be a domestic focus first, and then in time, some international visitors. Really, I think our message is don't rely on seeing any international visitors in 2020. If we get some, that'll be a massive bonus. But let's work on the rough basis that we're talking about domestic tourism only this year, and trying to rebuild those international markets for next year. But there's a lot that also needs to be done to coordinate the recovery of that domestic market, and we need to bring all the best brains together and people together, government and particularly the private sector, to make sure that we're doing this. I know a lot of people on the call will be interested on trends, refunds. We are still working very hard with the insurers to settle all that. It's all progressing fine. It just, insurance takes a little time. We hope, we certainly expect to be able to pay refunds back to all the sellers. That will be a very welcome injection of some cash back to you. It is also the time, I have to say, for everyone who's on the 1st of April year for paying TIA membership fees. Worst possible time to be asking you, sending people a bill, asking you for money. But like you, we need income to survive. So we're working through that at the moment, but we're looking to get you money back from Trends, but do also expect some invoices coming from TIA for membership fees, and those who are in any position to pay. Your payments to us will enable us to keep on doing the work we need to do for the industry. Kia ora.
Great, thanks, Chris. Fiona, over to you.
Thank you, Steve and Chris. Well, look, I think the value in today's session is really going to be around the questions. So I don't want to speak for too long, but I guess just to cover off if hopefully they solve some of your problems from the outset. So the first thing I want to speak briefly to is the wage subsidy. So many of you would have heard the announcement last Friday that you no longer have to be paying employees 80% to be eligible for that wage subsidy. You can purely apply for the wage subsidy and flick that to your employees if that is all you can do. Getting quite a few questions around the relationship between the wage subsidy and annual leave. And the government's made it very clear that you cannot compel people to take leave during this period, which is correct. The only exception to that would be you can give 14 days notice to people to take annual leave. That's the only exception to that rule. But we're getting a lot of questions around, well, if I use that 14-day rule, can I use the subsidy to pay that annual leave? And look, that's not definitive. My preference is no, because in an ideal world, a company would have money aside to pay for annual leave. And in my view, the better use of that is people might get the wage subsidy, the 585.50, but might get annual leave on top of that to essentially top them up every week. That's my preference of the relationship between the wage subsidy and annual leave, but I accept that there will be and any who are on this call that just don't even have enough money in the tin to pay annual leave at this point. So you may look to use the wage subsidy to pay annual leave, but it's not my preference. You have to pass the full wage subsidy on to employees. The only exception to that is if someone normally earns below the subsidy. In that case, you only have to pay them their normal pay and use the balance to essentially top up other employees. So an easy example of that is if you normally have someone who works for you 10 hours a week at $20 an hour, normally their pay would be $200 a week. Now, under the subsidy, you can get $350 for them because they're classified as part-time. So the takeaway from this is you don't have to flick the full $350 to that employee. You just have to pay them the $200, and the $50 is used for other employees to top them up. But the big takeaway from that is you still have to use it for wages. You can't use the money for other things like leases, as Chris has already touched on. There's also some confusion around whether or not you can make people redundant within the 12-week mark. The starting point is yes, and I'll touch on that process in a moment. But I guess as to what happens to the money, well, you can use that wage subsidy to pay that person's notice. Or if there's some shortfall, i.e. you've made them redundant, you've paid them out the notice, and you've still got 2-3 weeks of the subsidy left, under the subsidy rules, you are expected to give that money back to the government, okay? So you can make people redundant throughout this process, and in my view, you use that money to pay out their notice, but if there's any difference, you are obligated to pay the government. And just a final couple of comments about if/when you get to the point of making people redundant. Although we are in completely unprecedented times, it doesn't mean employment law has gone out the window, okay? You've still got to follow a process to make people redundant. And as an extension of that, if you are going through a selection process, so say for example, you've got 20 housekeepers and you need to reduce that to 10, you can't just say, right, you 10, you've got a job, the other 10 you don't. You do have to go through a selection process to wean it down from 20 to 10. So the takeaway from that is, even though these are extraordinary times, we're still stuck with the employment laws that we've got. Those are all I wanted to say from our opening comments perspective. Steve, you might now want to start working through some of the questions we've already got in.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Fiona. Just a reminder to participants, if you have any questions, to send them through on Q&A button there. We did receive some questions ahead of the webinar from members. Thank you for those, and I'll just run through some of those now. Fiona, you probably touched on some of them, but I'll just have a touch on, there's a couple here on redundancies. Work and Income's website now states that employers who are in receipt of the subsidy are obliged not to make redundancies during the period covered by the subsidy. Is this best endeavours only?
Yeah, so look, I agree, that is best endeavours. The government is expecting you not to make redundancies throughout this process, but many of you won't be able to sustain that. So as I just touched on before, if you end up in a situation where you do, I'm comfortable with the wage subsidy being used for notice. If you do end up with some money extra, it is expected that you provide that to the government.
Right. I think you've answered the next question already, and that is about can they use subsidy money towards paying employees their redundancy notice period? So,
as we talk right now, absolutely, but watch this space, I think.
all right, thank you. There is a couple here on annual leave, and you have touched on that. Just one question here. This one, wage staff are getting 80% of their wage, and they can top that up with top up the rest with a day of annual leave. However, salary staff in this instance have been advised they need to exhaust full annual leave before the company will top salary up to 100%. Some have quite a bit of annual leave, some not so much. Is that legal to do?
Yes, on the face of it, there's no issue with having different rules as to how wage and salaried employees use annual leave. And at the end of the day, even in a normal situation when an employee applies for annual leave, an employer can still say no to that. So in my view, the same rule applies.
For the upcoming public holidays, if we've reduced days of work by mutual agreement and they're now working Monday to Wednesday, are we correctly saying that Good Friday is no longer an ordinary working day and therefore not entitled to pay?
Yes, as we talk right now, and we think there might be some announcements around this, but I guess the test of whether or not it's an ordinary working day depends on what you've agreed during this period. So, Steve, referring to that example, my view is the Friday wouldn't be an ordinary working day, therefore the employee wouldn't be entitled to be paid for it. And I guess as an extension of that, a lot of agreements that employers and employees are reaching right now are overriding the normal terms and conditions of someone's employment. So for that example, Steve, I'd be comfortable for them not to be paid on Good Friday.
Thank you. A couple of general questions here. What are our obligations as employers to staff who refuse to come to work? Do we need to pay them the full subsidy?
Yeah, so this one's coming up quite a bit because many people, particularly the accommodation providers on this call, will be an essential service. And many of you will be facing the situation where employees are refusing to come to work. If you have applied for the wage subsidy under their name, you've still got a legal obligation to pass that wage subsidy on to them. Or alternatively, if you were not going to do that, you'd have to return that money to the government, in my view. The best way that employers are getting around this is actually finding a way to provide incentives to those who are coming to work. So one example I know, one hotel I'm working with at the moment, they're providing the wage subsidy to everyone. But then if you work, you get hours on top of that wage subsidy. So I think that the best way to get around this is not perhaps punish those who are refusing, but provide an incentive to those to come to work.
Thank you. If after full consultation an employee does not agree to a drop in contracted hours to 80% of current contract, what are our options and in what time frame?
So if someone doesn't agree, then you can look to possibly make them redundant, depending on their role in your business's circumstances. Them just not agreeing with you in itself isn't a factor to make someone redundant, but because of their agreement, if you can't keep the business going as normal, that might be a justification to make someone redundant. So I'm probably a little bit cautious to provide carte blanche advice on that issue on this webinar, but if you have someone who is refusing to reach another agreement. There will be situations where you can look to either put that person on leave without pay or make them redundant. And I guess as an extension of that, Steve, it's probably a good time to raise that in the normal environment, you would normally look to get employees' agreement on such issues. But what I'm finding a lot of employers are doing is kind of doing the reverse and essentially just consulting. So they're sending documents to staff that are saying, look, this is the situation we're in. We're looking at reducing everyone's hours or days by 80%. Let us know if you've got any issues with that, and then we'll make a decision. Now, that's probably not 100% legally right, but in the environment we're in, consultation is better than nothing. So once again, I'm reluctant to provide carte blanche advice on that issue, but that is something to keep in mind as well.
Thank you. Fiona, and possibly for you, Chris, is there any indication from government that if business levels don't improve by the end of the current subsidy, is it likely to be extended?
Chris, you might have a better handle on that one than me.
If they are thinking of that, they're giving no indication. They haven't ruled it out, but they certainly haven't ruled it in. So I think it's a wait and see. They'll be trying to get an indication of how many businesses are going to be making staff redundant at the end of the 12 weeks. So if all the 12 weeks does is delay the inevitable, then they will have to look at whether an extension or some other form of support is necessary, because they accept there's going to be a growing level of unemployment, but they don't want to see a mass arrival all on, literally within a week or two at the end of the 12 weeks, all going onto the dole queue. So certainly no indication at this stage, but if things are looking dire, then there may be something post the first 12 weeks.
Thanks, Chris. Quite a specific one, Fiona, this next one. The subsidy started on a Thursday. If we're now paying our first week in lockdown, we have some days of that week pre-lockdown and some post. Can we pay the pre-lockdown hours as per usual and the post-lockdown at 80% of usual, or what have been the roster?
Yes, if that's the agreement that's been reached with staff. So at a high level, I've got no issues with that, but it would depend a lot on what's been discussed with staff.
Sure. Another quite specific one. My employer is based in Australia and they pay me a salary directly. I'm based in Auckland and I'm set up as PAYE to IRD. I've mentioned I do not qualify for the Australian work subsidy. Because the company is not registered here in New Zealand, I don't qualify for the New Zealand work subsidy scheme either. Advice on that one? There's a wee bit more information.
Yeah, so look, it seems more than unfortunate that someone doesn't fit into either camp. Steve, what we might do is, I'll leave it in your book to remind me of that one offline, and we'll look to respond to that one offline, because we've got to find a way for that person to fall in one of those camps, in my view.
Sure. All right, just clicking into, there were some pre-questions and now some live questions we have. Keep sending those through. We've got 43 in there at the moment, so bear with me as I just through that. This one here, casual workers with varied working patterns, how to pay?
So if you're applying for the wage subsidy for them, the government is expecting you to look over the last 12 months and working out an average. So I would suggest, whether you're using the wage subsidy or not, I would suggest that's a really good guide, is to find an average over the last 12 months.
Okay. A staff member is rostered, refuses to attend. We may have already covered this off. It's easier to do leave without pay versus disciplinary action. However, what if the leave without pay means I'll end up below the wage subsidy? We have to pass on the full amount, but then they get away with not showing up for work. I think you've covered that off to a certain extent.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that, Steve, is if an employer was 100% confident with the health and safety measures that they'd put in place, then there is nothing stopping an employer from undertaking a disciplinary process with that employee. I guess there are two things I would add to that. One, I don't know if as a business that would be your priority right now, or if you'd have the energy for that. Secondly, you've got to look into the potential PR disaster. I can see the headlines now. Someone goes to the Herald and says, I didn't feel safe going to work because of COVID-19, and then I received this invitation to a disciplinary meeting. So legally it is possible. Practically, I don't know whether you'd turn your mind to it in this environment.
Sure. I've applied for a wage subsidy for an employee that has found a new job prior to the first subsidy payment was made. Does his wage subsidy then need to be returned to WINS, NST?
Yes, it does.
A team member has advised they cannot work because schools are closed and need to care for their children. Should the subsidy be paid to them, or is this personal leave?
Look, normally that would be personal leave. It would be annual leave, leave without pay, or if you wanted to, sick leave, and even though that's not 100% right. But my view is, if you've already applied for the wage subsidy for them, in that situation, I'm of the view that you couldn't use it for anything else. So I think you might as well just flick it to them, in all honesty.
This one here about redundancy notice. The member already knows they will have to make some staff redundant because we do not have work for them. We know we will not have work for them in 3 months either. Do I pay them for 12 weeks from the wage subsidies, from the wage support package, and then terminate their employment? When do I let them know? Do I let them know now?
No, look, it's my preference that you pay them the wage subsidy as per normal. Don't terminate their employment, and look to terminate at the end of the 12 weeks.
Right. And they can use a wage subsidy for the notice period, can't they?
In my view, yes.
Yeah. Please can you tell me my obligation for pay to 30-hour staff, sponsored staff on, this is on visas, so working holiday visas. I think we were going to seek some advice on that area, Fiona, is that correct?
Yeah, so look, I am an employment law specialist, but I know Steve has already highlighted to me that some immigration law questions are related to visas are coming through. So what we'll do there is, as opposed to me making a stab in the dark, we will direct those to a member of our immigration law team, and we'll come back to you on those.
Chris, one for you. What is the status of the Tourism New Zealand domestic campaign? Any update there?
Well, there is no such thing. There was $1 million given to 4 RTOs. It seems a lifetime ago. It was probably a month ago, when we still thought we could have, before the lockdown, we thought we could still have some domestic tourism. A little bit of that $1 million may have been spent by Auckland, Christchurch, Rotorua and Queenstown, but generally it wasn't. It was all put on hold, and then of course everything changed, so there's no opportunity for a domestic tourism campaign at the moment. So that $1 million sitting there with the RTOs largely unspent. $10 million was given to Tourism New Zealand for international tourism. That's pretty much sitting there unspent as well. I do know that Tourism New Zealand is doing some very early initial thinking about what its role might be in the domestic recovery. Not part of its mandate, of course, but they do have some very smart, clever people with regard to marketing, and they're doing some thinking about that at the moment. There's certainly no campaign.
Thanks, Chris. I noticed we've just clicked into 2:30 was when we were initially scheduled to finish. We will continue. We've got nearly 60 questions here, so we'll continue to work through some of those for at least another 15 minutes. Fiona, I thought it might just be useful to touch on that if we don't answer all questions, members are invited to contact you if they have a specific query?
Yeah, so look, we're happy free of charge to answer one-off queries that you send to us, because I know there will be questions today that are quite fact dependent to your situation. So I'm really happy to answer those free of charge. If more substantial work is required, we'd provide an estimate for that for you. But for one-off queries, please feel free to email me. My details are on the Lane Neave website, and myself or one of the team will answer those free of charge, no problem.
Fiona, questions here, one in regards to minimum wage and then Kiwisaver. The wage subsidy will generally not be enough to cover 80% of a full-time staff member on the new minimum wage. With most businesses having very little to no revenue, how can we pay staff who do not accept to reduce their contracted hours?
So Jacinda and Grant, when they made their announcement on Friday, made it very clear that in an ideal world, employers would be using this subsidy as a way of paying employees at least 80% of what they normally earn. But they have accepted and conceded in this policy that that may just not be possible for some employers in New Zealand. So what they have said and made it very clear in the policy, if you can't do that, apply for the subsidy on the employee's behalf and just flick them that. Now, I accept that that completely undermines A, what someone's normally contractually entitled to, and B, also our minimum wage increase of yesterday. So those two things don't sit very well together. And I guess this links back to a previous question, Steve. If an employee says, no, I don't agree to that, then you might work through with them options of either taking leave without pay or potentially making them redundant. And I'm finding when most employees have those three options in front of them, taking the wage subsidy is better than nothing.
Thank you. Is the employer Kiwisaver contribution included in the wage subsidy, or do we have to pay that on top of the 585?
So is this the employer contribution?
Yes, this is the employer.
Yeah. So look, legally, my view is you'd be required to pay it on top of, but I accept practically in this environment that's probably not happening, and employers are just saying to employees, this 585 is inclusive.
This comment here, with virtually no revenue, and if staff that were unable to pay the 80% of their wage and simply passing on the government subsidy, some employees have contacted WINS and are able to apply for additional support. But they need a letter from their employer saying that we're unable to pay any more. In this case, how should this letter from the employer be worded?
Look, I'd keep it very simple. I'd just say X is employed with us in Y role. We currently can't supply this person with work. Therefore, all we can afford to do is apply for the wage subsidy on their behalf and flick the whole amount to them. I'd keep it very simple. You're not required to provide any further detail than that.
What's an example of the selection process for redundancy?
So if I use my example of you've got 20 housekeepers and you're narrowing that down to 10, you might look at selection criteria like length of service with you, whether or not they have had any performance issues with you, whether or not they've had any attendance issues, how long they have been in the hotel industry, for example. And very briefly, once you've made the decision following consultation to go from 20 to 10, you'd then say to the housekeepers, right, this is the criteria we're looking at applying. What's your view on that? And then once you've received feedback on that criteria, you would apply that criteria. So what a lot of employers do is essentially mark every criteria out of 5 for each individual. And essentially the 10 housekeepers with the highest scores end up with the 10 roles. So that's probably a fairly simplistic explanation, but you can draft criteria that are factors that are important to you, important to your industry, important to that particular role.
Thank you. What is normal hours? Are they the same as minimum contracted hours?
No, so particularly in relation to the wage subsidy, you are expected to look at the average over the previous 12 months. But some employers are saying to me, Fiona, when we do that, it's just too high. We can't afford that. And then they're just paying the minimum contracted hours. That's not 100% legally right, particularly in light of the wage subsidy. But that is one way employers are trying to get around that issue.
Does the wage subsidy payments made to staff accrue annual leave?
Yes.
We have staff that were doing over 20 hours. However, as we come into the quieter period, we would normally have them doing 15 hours on the roster. Should we pay them for the hours they would have been rostered to work, or do we inflate what we would have paid them up to the subsidy?
I think once again, I think I'd look over the average over the previous 12 months just to cover those seasonal issues.
Can employees be eligible for a wage subsidy from two separate employers?
Yes, and that's happening. There are a lot of New Zealanders who have 2-3 jobs, and they're currently getting 2-3 lots of wage subsidies, and that is compliant.
If I'm only going to pay the $585 per week, then do I just scale hours back accordingly? My employees were on higher salaries, so is that?
So technically yes, but what we're finding at the moment is employees are seeing that potentially the more effort they put in now and the more they do to help out, the higher chance of them having a job at the end of the 12-week mark. So a lot of employees are doing some pretty amazing things out there and are working their normal hours just for 585. I guess there are two things about that. One, you should still technically be paying employees above the minimum wage, so I need you to keep that in mind. Secondly, I actually listened into another webinar this morning with the Ministry of Social Development, and they said that they had no issues with employers saying, look, if you work these hours now, we know that's going to put you under minimum wage, but once we come right, we'll top you back up. Now, I can see why the Ministry of Social Development is saying that, because they're wanting people to get the wage subsidy, they're wanting businesses to stay open, and they're wanting there to be jobs at the end. I don't know how the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment will feel about that. Their position has always been that someone should receive at least the minimum wage every week for hours worked. But that is one option if you were to reach an agreement with your staff, but I don't love it, to be honest, but it is an option.
Now, this question is on wellbeing. What are your thoughts or options for staff wellbeing? Those who are currently working, confused and stressed about the future, or transitioning through a redundancy process?
I guess there are a couple of big things for me. One is communication. The more that people know, the more at ease that they feel. So if you have information, share that with your employees. Or alternatively, if you're looking at reviewing things in 3-4 weeks' time, say that. That stops them, I guess, essentially stressing every day, wondering if they're going to hear something. So the first part of it for me is communication. The second thing is I've seen some employers put some great packages together about, hey, look, we understand financially things are pretty tight for you at the moment. Here are some links to websites of places where you can go. So providing information around Kiwisaver holidays, providing information around who to talk to at banks around mortgage holidays, etc. So many employers won't be able to pay for their normal EAP programs that they perhaps normally provide. But what I'm finding at the moment is the more that employers are communicating with employees and the more that they're providing information to them, the better off everyone is.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions here. They're coming through slightly irregularly, but I know you've touched on them before, but we'll just reconfirm. Can we use the money that's saved from one person to top up another with the government wage subsidy?
Yes, as long as you are paying the first person their normal wage.
Sorry, could you just confirm if we cannot meet the 80% obligation, we pay the $585?
Yes, correct. That is fine.
I think you've touched on this, but we'll just, do I have any recourse if I task staff on the wage subsidy with work outside their normal jobs, e.g. maintenance tasks, and they say they don't want to do that work?
Sorry, Steve, could you repeat that question again?
Any recourse if an employer tasks staff on the wage subsidy with work outside their normal jobs, could be a maintenance task, and they say they don't want to do that work?
Yeah, see, I guess that's a little bit different because you're asking them to do something that they don't normally do. And once again, I think you would struggle to penalise them from a wage subsidy perspective. But what you could do is incentivise other employees to do those tasks. And you might find that works a little bit better.
Scrolling through here. This one on average hours. If I have team members who are on less than the $585 per week, but working more than 20 hours, can I look at the average hours they have worked, for example, 22 hours, and pay them this, then use the difference to pay other employees?
Yes, you can. And my preference is you look at an average over 12 months. And that's what the government's recommending as well. It's not just me.
Okay, this one's slightly different, but on that refusal to work one, as an essential service business, accommodation, this one, staff are refusing to come in for work as there are no guests at this stage. We have alternative tasks in the building, which you've touched on, keeping the rooms dust-free, etc. Do we just default to abandonment and IEAs?
No, so you can't use abandonment in that situation because you are communicating with the staff, even though you're hearing answers that you don't want. So in that case, you would either go through a disciplinary or merely just flip them the wage subsidy. You could risk it and not even do that, but I think you're heading into pretty murky waters at that point.
Right. Is there an average time for the subsidy to be paid? And I'm assuming that's, I'm not too sure if that's meant from MSD to the employer or for the employer to pass on.
Well, I guess to answer both, from employer to employee, you should be attempting to pay this money in your normal pay cycle. Because as we all know, we've all got APs that come out on in line with our paydays. So it would be good if you could flip the wage subsidy in their normal pay cycle. As for the length of payment, and Chris, you might have feedback on this as well. I know MSD were endeavouring to make payments within 5 days. When applications were first being made, clients were saying to me that the payments were being made in 48 hours, but it's definitely slowed down now. I've had some employer clients today who've said to me, Fiona, we've been holding on for 7-8 days. We can't hold on any longer. Who do we contact? So I guess, and Chris, I'll turn to you in a moment to see if you've heard anything in this area. But what I would add to that, because there does seem to be some delays now, if you are thinking about applying, I wouldn't muck around. I'd get onto it ASAP because the payments aren't happening as quickly as they were. Chris, have you got anything to add there? Have you heard anything there?
Yeah, they certainly did a remarkable job early on, and you're right, a lot of people were getting them within 48 or 72 hours. I think there's now approaching 500,000 employees covered by the wage sub, or applications have gone in for about 500,000 employees, and the last figure I heard was about 100,000 employees were still to be processed. So it is starting to clog up a bit. They've put as many staff on this as possible. There may be some of the more more complex or difficult ones, or any that are a little bit short on information that have been held up. But the one flaw in the system, and it's really not possible, I don't think at this stage, to fix it, is there is really no one to contact. You put in your application and you wait to hear. They simply have all their staff dedicated to processing the applications. They don't have another team that can take inquiries and track your application and see where it's at. So it's tough on people who are just sitting there waiting to hear, but they are doing their best to process as quickly as possible. But I can totally understand the frustration if you've now been waiting 7, 8, 9 days and you don't know when you're going to hear.
And I guess, Chris, as an extension of what you've just said, the more information you provide MSD and the more accurate your application, the more likely it is going to go through a little bit quicker. So I guess the work you do at that front end might assist you a little bit later on.
Thanks. I see we've clicked over 2:45 p.m. We've still got more than 200 participants online, so we'll keep going, Fiona, for another 10 minutes or so.
That's fine. I've got nowhere to be.
This one's around the upcoming public holidays. What if someone's being made redundant and they're being paid in lieu of notice as per their employment agreement, and they work rostered hours? What would you suggest for the payment of public holidays that fall within their notice period?
So if, in your view, that would be an ordinary working day for them, if it wasn't for the fact that you've made them redundant and they're receiving their notice in lieu, in my view, they would be entitled to it. The only caveat I would add to that is there are some agreements between employers and employees going on where an employer is saying, look, I don't have enough money to pay you your full notice. I'm just going to flick you your wage subsidy as your notice. Do you agree? And some employees are saying, well, look, that's better than nothing. So in my view, that would override the public holidays situation. But Steve, for the example that you gave, that would be an ordinary working day for that employee, so they should receive it.
Okay, right. All right, and as you probably answered here, but just if in that answer, I'll just check. If we have staff off on 0 hours, but paying the subsidy, do we again need to pay for these public holidays?
No, so in my view, your agreement that you've reached with the staff about the wage subsidy would override them being entitled to a public holiday.
Okay. Sorry, I think a couple of you have asked, I'm just scrolling through. There's a question here, can you please advise a contact email for MSD for updating details, as it's impossible to get through to them on the phone? I think we have Denise's email, and it could be on our website. Cheryl, tell me if I've got that wrong. I know it was also in our invite to the webinar we just sent out. But we certainly do have Denise's email at MSD, and perhaps the best thing is to just flick us a quick email at info@tia.org.nz. That's info@tia.org.nz, and we'll send you Denise's contact. Is there any definition, Fiona, is there any definition for when the 12-week subsidy period commenced? Is it from the date of announcement or from the date payment was received?
Sorry, can you say that second bit again, Steve?
So it's the definition for when the 12-week government subsidy period commenced. Is it from the date of announcement or from the date payment was received?
That's something that I wouldn't mind checking offline and perhaps reporting back to you, Steve, to share. I think it's from the date of application or from the date of acceptance, but I could be wrong there. So I wouldn't mind just double checking that point.
Sure. Fiona, are there currently any options to stand down employees? There seems to be happening in Australia. This seems to be where employees are stood down without pay for a period and then resume their role when operations resume.
Yeah, so stand down is an Australian thing. It's not an option here in New Zealand, but we do have some other options like it. So the first is you might reach an agreement with your employees that they take leave without pay for a period of time, and once you kick off again, then they will start working for you again and be paid. Probably with the wage subsidy scheme that we have, I would suggest it's unnecessary for people to take leave without pay, but that is an option. The second thing that we have in New Zealand, which is kind of like that, is many of you will have force majeure clauses in your employment agreements, and depending on how they are drafted, they may allow you to not pay your employees for a period of time, or alternatively even terminate the employee's employment. I guess a couple of things about force majeure clauses in New Zealand. One, it depends heavily on how they're drafted. So once again, I'm a bit reluctant to provide some carte blanche advice about them. Secondly, they haven't really been ever used in New Zealand. So us employment lawyers are a little bit nervous about them. I practiced in Christchurch throughout the time of the earthquake, and we never really used them then. So they are an option to you. Just be very wary of how they've drafted. But at the end of the day, you can reach an agreement with employees around leave without pay.
Thank you. This one, we have staff as around fixed term contracts. We have staff who applied for the subsidy and their fixed term contracts end in April, May. Will there be an option to keep the staff employed and continue to receive the subsidy? Or will we have to end their contracts as planned and advise we should not continue to get the subsidy for them? One is maternity leave cover, and some were employed for the cruise season only.
So you can legally do both, and I'm finding a lot of employers are saying to people, look, we'll just extend your fixed term agreement and flick you the wage subsidy for the whole period, or alternatively they are terminating or ending as planned, and then employers are returning that money to the government. The situation where I'm seeing this arise a lot, and this is happening quite a bit in Queenstown, but no doubt it's happening to many other areas around New Zealand as well, is with this tourism season essentially coming to an end, employers had a lot of employees on working holiday visas, and the problem is if employers don't extend these fixed term agreements for these individuals, they're going to A, be stuck without money, B, they can't go home at the moment, and they're not entitled to any benefits in New Zealand. They're stuck in New Zealand with no money. So as a result of that, there are employers who are saying, hey, look, we can help you out here. We'll just extend it. We'll flick you the wage subsidy, and that might keep you going for a few weeks. And there are no issues with that.
What do we do with staff on maternity leave?
So the wage subsidy won't be applying to them. I have become aware of a couple of situations where if an employee on maternity leave was due to return in the next few weeks, they're agreeing that they start early and get them on that wage subsidy to get them some income. But that's quite rare because normally these individuals had planned to not be earning throughout this period anyway. I guess the only thing I would add to that is if you are looking to make redundancies and one or more of those people are on maternity leave, the same law applies to them. You still have to consult with employees who are not currently at work.
This one, we have staff on casual contracts and we've only just applied for the wage subsidy for them. So far, we've not been paying them anything in line with their employment agreement that we only pay for hours worked. Mm-hmm. Do we need to pay them back pay for the weeks that we have not yet paid them once we receive the subsidy, or just pay them going forward from that day?
So if you receive the wage subsidy for them in arrears, then you will be required to flick that to them. But because you've applied under their names essentially, but if you apply for the wage subsidy for them this week, you get the money this week, then you're only obligated to pay from this week on.
Closing question now, I'm mindful of time. I signed a contract with a new employee who would have started a day before the shutdown. Can I apply for a wage subsidy for her?
Yes, you can.
I think some of these we have ticked off. Yes, so the last one, which I think if an employee leaves at the end of April, what would we need to do to pay back to MSP?
I believe there is a mechanism on the website in which you can pay back the government. I don't have that to hand, but I understand there is a link to do that.
Okay, well, we'll draw that to a close now. We didn't get through all the questions. Thank you, firstly, to all our members for participating in this webinar today. I hope you found it useful. There was certainly a lot of questions there. And as Fiona has offered, if you have a particular question that you'd like to put to Fiona, then she invites you to do that, and her contact details on the Lane Neave website. So thank you all to our members for participating today. I'd also like to thank our panellists. Thanks very much to Fiona and to Chris for firstly your presentations, but also answering questions. Thank you very much for your time. Just a couple of closing comments to members from myself for information. Certainly the webinar will be, you'll be able to see the recording again. There was a lot of information in there today. If you'd like to go through it again, then you can just look through the webinar. I will have that up on our website at TIA by the end of the week. So by the end of tomorrow, I'm sure. So you'll be able to go on there and see it again. So that's www.tia.org.nz. And we also, there's a lot of information there that our comms team are posting regularly on COVID, information, advice and support for operators and travellers, regularly updated. So please go to the TIA website if you're also looking for other information. And invite you also with any particular queries for TIA to send those through to info@tia.org.nz. We have a team responding to those queries, so we encourage you to send those through. And of course, always feel free to give us a call if you'd like to discuss them. So Chris, back to you for closing karakia.
Thanks, Steve. And I see 150 of you are still hanging in there to the bitter end. So, and there were a couple of questions. Fiona did an unbelievable job answering all those questions. There were a couple there directed at me that I can answer very, very quickly. What might happen to domestic flight schedules? Air New Zealand's announced a very, very limited schedule today that will apply during the lockdown. But my understanding from Air New Zealand is that when the lockdown is lifted, that number of domestic flights will increase. Obviously, people will need to start moving around the country for various reasons. If the university tertiary institutions reopen, for example. So do expect there to be more domestic flights made available when the lockdown is lifted. The other one was on tax bills, whether those with the March 31st year who have made a good profit in the last 12 months might be able to avoid paying tax on that profit and roll it over into the new year when they're going to almost certainly make a loss. Look, that's an issue that goes well beyond tourism, and we'll raise that one with Business New Zealand and see what lobbying the business community can do on that. On the face of it, it makes a lot of sense. I'm sure IRD's got a lot of reasons why that wouldn't work, but we'll take that up with our colleagues at Business New Zealand. So just to close for today, and look out for the next webinar that we'll be providing. Kia tau tō rangamari ki runga e ngā iwi o te ao. Let peace reign on all the people of the world. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Chris.
Thank you.